Perhaps you tapped a card this morning without thinking, or glanced at your phone to check a balance. Maybe you walked past a bank branch on a quiet street, its glass doors reflecting the ordinary bustle of the day. These small moments feel unremarkable, routine, invisible. And yet behind each tap, each glance, each quiet transaction, lies something extraordinary. Thousands of years of human ingenuity, crisis, and careful refinement have built the invisible architecture that moves money safely from hand to hand across oceans and through time. Tonight, we'll trace the gentle arc of banking story, from the cool storerooms of ancient temples to the hum of modern servers. We'll meet merchants and monarchs, goldsmiths and visionaries, all of them solving the same timeless problem: how to keep something valuable safe until it is needed again. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and drift with us through the sleepy history of banking. Long before there were banks as we know them, before marble columns or brass nameplates, there were temples. And in those temples, in the warm river valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, something remarkable was beginning to take shape. Picture the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, roughly 5,000 years ago. This is the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of civilization, where some of humanity's first cities rose from the floodplains: Ur, Uruk, Babylon, names that echo across millennia. And in these cities stood great temple complexes, ziggurats reaching toward the sky, dedicated to gods with names like Shamash and Marduk and Inanna. These temples were more than places of worship. They were the beating hearts of their communities, centers of learning, administration, and something that might surprise us. They were also, in a very real sense, the world's first banks. The temples accumulated wealth. Farmers brought offerings of grain, merchants donated silver, and over time these religious institutions became custodians of considerable treasure. But more importantly, they became places of trust. In a world without police forces or insurance companies, the temples offered something invaluable: safety. The goods stored within their thick mud brick walls were protected by the authority of the gods themselves. Who would dare steal from a temple? And so people began to deposit their valuables with the priests. A farmer might store his surplus grain in the temple granary, knowing it would be safe until he needed it. A merchant might leave silver in the temple's keeping while travelling to distant cities. The temple, in return, kept careful records of who had deposited what. This record-keeping was crucial, and it drove one of humanity's most important inventions. The earliest writing systems, including the cuneiform script of Mesopotamia, developed partly to track these deposits and loans. When you see those wedge-shaped marks pressed into ancient clay tablets, many of them are not poetry or prayers. They are receipts. They are ledgers. They are, in essence, bank statements. The clay tablets from ancient Sumer and Babylon tell us remarkable things about how these early financial systems worked. A tablet might record that a certain farmer deposited 30 bushels of barley with the temple to be returned after the harvest. Another might note that a merchant borrowed silver at a specified rate of interest, to be repaid when his trading voyage was complete. Interest itself seems to have emerged quite naturally from agricultural lending. If you borrowed grain to plant in the spring, you would repay it after the harvest, and of course you would repay more than you borrowed. The field had produced a surplus, and some of that surplus belonged to the lender who had made the planting possible. The Sumerian word for interest was mash, which meant calf or offspring. Interest was simply the natural increase, the way that herds multiply and fields yield more than was planted. The rates of interest in ancient Mesopotamia were not arbitrary. They were often regulated by custom and eventually by law. One of the most famous legal codes in history, the Code of Hammurabi, carved into a black stone pillar around 1754 years before the Common Era, contains detailed provisions about lending and borrowing. Hammurabi was king of Babylon, and his code covered everything from property disputes to family law. But roughly a quarter of its nearly 300 laws dealt with commercial and financial matters. The code set maximum interest rates, 33.33% on grain loans, 20% on silver. It specified what should happen if a borrower could not repay due to crop failure. It established rules for how deposits should be handled and what happened if a warehouse lost goods entrusted to its care. These ancient laws reveal a sophisticated understanding of financial relationships. They show that people in Hammurabi's time were grappling with the same questions that concern us today. How do we balance the rights of lenders and borrowers? What happens when someone cannot repay a debt? How do we ensure that those who safeguard our valuables remain trustworthy? The temple banks of Mesopotamia did more than simply store wealth. They also made loans, extending credit to farmers, merchants, and even to the state itself. A temple might lend grain to a farmer who'd run short before the harvest, or advance silver to a merchant undertaking a trading expedition. The temple, with its accumulated resources and its aura of divine authority, was uniquely positioned to serve as the hub of the local economy. Over time, private individuals also entered the banking business. Wealthy families in Babylon and other cities began to offer similar services, accepting deposits, making loans, and facilitating payments. The Agibi family, for example, operated what we might call a private bank in Babylon for 5 generations, from roughly the 7th to the 5th centuries before the Common Era. Their clay tablet records, thousands of which have survived, show a thriving business of loans, property transactions, and commercial investments. These early bankers developed clever techniques for moving money without physically transporting it. Imagine a merchant in Babylon who needs to pay a supplier in another city. Rather than carrying heavy silver across dangerous roads, he might give the silver to a local banker and receive a clay tablet, a written instruction for the banker's associate in the destination city to pay the equivalent amount. This was an early form of the bill of exchange, the ancestor of checks and wire transfers. Meanwhile, another great civilization was developing its own approach to banking. In ancient Egypt, along the fertile banks of the Nile, a system of state-run grain banks emerged that was remarkably sophisticated for its time. The Egyptian economy relied heavily on grain, particularly wheat and barley. Taxes were often paid in grain, wages were sometimes paid in grain, and the state maintained enormous granaries to store the harvest and distribute food during lean years. These granaries functioned much like a national banking system. Farmers would deposit their grain at local granaries and receive written receipts. These receipts could then be used to make payments or transfers. If a farmer in one village owed payment to someone in another village, the transfer could be made simply by adjusting the records in the respective granaries. No physical grain needed to move at all. This was, in essence, a system of giro transfers, payments made by book entry rather than by handing over physical currency. The system required extensive record keeping and a bureaucracy to manage it. Scribes carefully tracked deposits and withdrawals, and the accounts had to balance. Errors or fraud could have serious consequences. But when it worked well, and for the most part it did, the Egyptian grain banking system allowed the economy to function smoothly, even in a world with limited coinage. It is worth pausing to appreciate what these ancient peoples accomplished. Without computers, without paper, without the mathematical tools we take for granted, they created systems for storing value, extending credit, and making payments across distances. They developed concepts of interest and collateral, of deposit and withdrawal, of accounting and auditing. They laid the foundations upon which all subsequent banking would be built, and they did this not through grand theoretical insight but through practical necessity. A farmer needed somewhere safe to store his grain. A merchant needed a way to pay for goods in a distant city. A temple needed to track the offerings it received. Each small problem, solved with patience and ingenuity, added another brick to the edifice of banking. The temples and granaries of the ancient world have long since crumbled to dust. The clay tablets that recorded their transactions are scattered. In museums across the globe, their wedge-shaped writing deciphered by scholars over the past 2 centuries. But the principles those early bankers established, the concepts of deposits and loans, of interest and record-keeping, of trust and accountability, these have never disappeared. When you deposit money in a bank today, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back to the temples of Sumer. When you pay interest on a loan, you are honouring a concept as old as agriculture itself. The forms have changed beyond recognition, but the essence remains. In the cool storerooms of those ancient temples, surrounded by jars of grain and boxes of silver, the first bankers solved problems that we still face today. How do we keep our wealth safe? How do we put idle resources to productive use? How do we extend trust across time and distance? These questions would echo through the centuries that followed. They would be taken up by Greek money changers and Roman financiers, by medieval merchants and Renaissance princes, by Goldsmith bankers in London and central bankers in Washington. Each generation would add its own innovations, its own solutions, its own refinements, but they were all building on foundations laid in Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago, when priests first began to count the grain. The ideas that emerged in Mesopotamia and Egypt did not remain confined to those river valleys. As centuries passed and civilizations rose and fell, the principles of banking spread along trade routes, carried by merchants and migrants to new lands and new peoples, and in the sunlit world of ancient Greece, banking would take on new forms and reach new levels of sophistication. But first came an innovation that would transform commerce entirely. Around 650 years before the Common Era, in the kingdom of Lydia, in what is now Western Turkey, someone had a remarkable idea. They took lumps of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, and stamped them with official marks guaranteeing their weight and purity. These were the world's first true coins. Before coinage, trade required either barter or the careful weighing of precious metals. A merchant buying goods in a foreign city had to carry scales and weights, and both buyer and seller had to trust that the metal was pure. Coinage solved these problems elegantly. A coin was a standardized unit of value, its worth guaranteed by the stamp of a king or a city. You could count coins rather than weighing them, and you could trust their value at a glance. The invention spread rapidly through the Mediterranean world. Greek city-states began minting their own coins, each with distinctive designs. Athens became famous for its silver owls, coins stamped with the image of the goddess Athena's sacred bird. These Athenian owls became one of the most trusted currencies in the ancient world, accepted by merchants from Spain to Persia. Coinage created new possibilities and new problems. With so many different cities minting their own coins, merchants needed a way to exchange one currency for another. They needed to know the relative values of different coins and to convert between them. This is where a new profession emerged, one that would evolve into banking as the Greeks knew it. In the bustling agora of Athens, the great marketplace at the heart of the city, you would have found men sitting at small tables, surrounded by stacks of coins and simple scales. These were the trapezitai, a word that literally meant table men. Their tables, called trapezai, gave them their name, and from these humble tables perched in the shade of colonnades, Greek banking was born. The trapezitai began as money changers. A merchant arriving from Corinth or Syracuse would bring coins from his home city and exchange them for Athenian currency at the trapezitai's table. The banker would examine the foreign coins, assess their silver content and offer a rate of exchange, keeping a small commission for his trouble. But money changing was just the beginning. The trapezitai soon discovered that their tables made convenient places for people to leave their money. A visitor to Athens might deposit his coins with the trapezitai, rather than carrying them around the crowded, sometimes dangerous streets. The banker would keep the coins safe and return them when asked. This was deposit banking, much like what the temples of Mesopotamia had offered centuries earlier. And where there were deposits, there could be loans. The trapezitai realized that their depositors rarely withdrew all their money at once. Some coins always sat in the strongbox idle. Why not lend this idle money to others who needed it, charging interest for the privilege? The depositor's money would remain available for withdrawal, while the loan would generate income for the banker. This was the same discovery that bankers have made in every age, the foundational insight of banking, that money deposited can be money lent. Athenian bankers lent money for all sorts of purposes. They financed trading voyages, charging higher interest for riskier journeys. They provided loans secured by property or slaves. They advanced money to wealthy citizens who needed cash before their estates produced income. Interest rates varied depending on the risk involved, typically ranging from 10 to 18% per year for ordinary loans, but sometimes reaching 30% or more for particularly speculative ventures. One type of loan was especially important in a maritime trading economy. The bottomry loan, known in Greek as nautikon danion, was a loan secured by a ship and its cargo. If the voyage succeeded, the borrower repaid the loan with substantial interest. But if the ship was lost at sea, the loan was forgiven entirely. The lender bore the risk of the voyage and in exchange received a higher return when things went well. This was an early form of insurance combined with lending, a way of spreading maritime risk that would remain important for centuries. Perhaps the most remarkable banker in ancient Athens was a man named Passion. His story reads like something from a novel. Passion began his life as a slave, owned by two Athenian bankers. He worked in their banking business, learning the trade from the inside, handling the daily transactions, getting to know the clients, earning a reputation for intelligence and reliability. His owners eventually freed him, and Passion took over the banking business. Through skill and hard work, he built it into the most successful bank in Athens. He made loans to merchants and aristocrats, to cities and kings. He owned a shield factory that employed 60 slaves. He became wealthy enough to fund warships for the Athenian navy, a public service that earned him something rare and precious: Athenian citizenship. Passion died around 370 years before the Common Era, one of the richest men in Athens. His rise from slave to citizen, from property to proprietor, tells us something about the possibilities that banking could offer, even in the ancient world. It also tells us about the skills that made a successful banker: careful record keeping, an ability to judge character and risk, and above all, the cultivation of trust. When Passion died, his bank was worth 60 talents, an enormous sum. His former slave Phormion, following the same path Passion had walked, eventually took over the business and became a citizen himself. The banking profession, it seems, had a way of elevating capable individuals regardless of their origins. As Athens flourished, so did its banking industry. By the 4th century before the Common Era, there were perhaps a dozen major banks operating in the city, along with numerous smaller money changers. Banking had become an established profession, essential to the functioning of commerce and public finance alike. Far to the west, another civilization was rising that would eventually eclipse Greece and inherit its financial traditions. Rome began as a small city on the banks of the Tiber River, but over the centuries it grew into a vast empire spanning the Mediterranean world and beyond. And as Rome grew, so did its need for sophisticated financial services. Roman bankers were known as argentarii, a word derived from argentum meaning silver. Like their Greek predecessors, the argentarii started as money changers, operating from small shops or stalls in the Roman Forum, that great public space at the heart of the city. They sat at their benches surrounded by coins and ledgers, conducting the daily business of exchange. The Latin word for these benches was banca, and from this humble word, from the simple wooden bench where a Roman banker sat, we get our modern word bank. Every bank in the world, from the grandest investment house to the smallest credit union, carries in its name the memory of those benches in the Forum. The argentarii offered a range of services that would be familiar to any modern banker. They accepted deposits, both on demand and for fixed terms. They made loans, secured by property or guaranteed by third parties. They facilitated payments between customers, transferring funds by book entry rather than physical coin. They even offered something like checking accounts, allowing customers to write orders instructing the bank to pay specified amounts to others. Roman banking was more regulated than Greek banking had been. The argentarii were required to keep detailed records of their transactions, and these records could be demanded as evidence in legal proceedings. Banking had become important enough to require formal oversight and legal protection. The Romans also developed sophisticated systems for financing long-distance trade. The permutatio, or letter of credit, allowed merchants to travel without carrying large amounts of coin. A merchant in Rome could deposit money with a banker and receive a letter instructing the banker's correspondent in Alexandria or Antioch to pay out the equivalent amount. The money, in effect, travelled on paper, while the merchant travelled light and safe. Roman interest rates were generally lower than Greek rates had been, typically ranging from 4 to 12% per year. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest written law code from around 450 years before the Common Era, set a maximum interest rate of 8.33%. Later laws adjusted this figure, and by the time of the late Republic, rates of up to 12% were common and accepted. One particularly Roman innovation was the Societas Publicanorum, a type of company formed to bid on public contracts, particularly the collection of taxes in the provinces. These companies sold shares to investors who received a portion of the profits. The shares could be bought and sold, and their prices fluctuated based on the company's perceived prospects. This was not banking exactly, but it was a related financial innovation, a way of pooling capital and spreading risk that would echo through the centuries to come. At its height, the Roman Empire provided the conditions in which banking could thrive: a stable currency, enforceable contracts, safe trade routes, and a large integrated market. Bankers in Rome could do business with correspondents in Britain or Syria, confident that the same laws and customs would apply. But nothing lasts forever. The Roman Empire, vast and powerful as it was, eventually began to crumble. The western half of the empire fell to successive waves of invasion during the 5th century of the Common Era. Cities shrank, trade routes became dangerous, and the complex economic system that had supported banking gradually unwound. In the centuries that followed, banking in Western Europe entered a long quiet period. The skills did not vanish entirely. Monasteries preserved some knowledge of accounting and finance, and local money changers continued to operate in major towns. But the sophisticated networks of the Roman era were gone. The great banks with their letters of credit and their far-flung correspondence were no more. The early medieval economy was simpler, more local, more reliant on barter and direct exchange. Money was scarcer, and the need for banking services was correspondingly reduced. This was not a dark age exactly, but it was a quieter one, a period of consolidation rather than expansion. Yet the ideas themselves endured. The concept of the deposit, the loan, the letter of credit, the banker's careful ledger, these had been discovered and would not be forgotten. They waited, preserved in the practices of money changers and the memories of merchants, ready to be rediscovered when circumstances changed. And circumstances would change. New trade routes would open, new cities would rise, and the need for banking would return stronger than ever. In the monasteries and market towns of medieval Europe, in the bustling ports of Italy and the counting houses of Flanders, banking would be reborn. But that is a story for another chapter of our journey. For now, let us simply rest with the image of those ancient bankers at their tables, the Greek trapezitai in the shade of the Athenian agora, coins glinting in the Mediterranean sun, the Roman argentarii in the forum, their benches giving us the very word we use today. They were practical people, solving practical problems, building something that would outlast their empires. The coins they handled have long since been melted down or buried in museum cases. The tablets they wrote upon have crumbled to dust. But the work they did, the systems they created, the trust they built, these things endure. They are part of the story that leads from their world to ours, from their tables to the banks we know today. The quiet centuries that followed Rome's fall were not empty of commerce, but they were simpler, slower, more local in their rhythms. The great trading networks of antiquity had fragmented, and with them the sophisticated banking systems that had served them. Yet even in this more modest era, the needs that had given rise to banking did not disappear. They simply waited, like seeds beneath winter snow, for conditions that would allow them to flourish once again. In early medieval Europe, the economy operated on a smaller scale than it had under Rome. Most people lived in rural villages, growing their own food, making their own clothes, rarely venturing beyond the boundaries of their local lord's estate. Money was scarce, and much of daily life operated through barter or through obligations of service rather than cash payment. but money never vanished entirely. Kings needed it to pay soldiers and administrators. Merchants needed it to buy goods from distant lands. Churches needed it to build cathedrals and support their clergy. And wherever money existed, someone had to manage it, to change it, to lend it, to keep it safe. Monasteries played an unexpectedly important role in preserving financial knowledge during these centuries. The great religious houses were islands of literacy in a largely illiterate world. Monks kept careful records of their lands and income, managed complex estates, and sometimes served as bankers to local nobles who needed to store valuables or borrow funds. The skills of accounting and administration, developed over centuries, found refuge behind monastery walls. But the church's relationship with banking was complicated by a fundamental theological concern. The Bible, in several passages, seemed to prohibit the charging of interest on loans. "Lend, expecting nothing in return," Jesus had said in the Gospel of Luke. The Old Testament forbade Jews from charging interest to fellow Jews, though it permitted interest on loans to foreigners. Medieval theologians interpreted these passages strictly. Charging interest, which they called usury, was a sin. It was making money from money itself rather than from productive labour. It was exploiting the needy. It was, some argued, attempting to sell time, which belonged to God alone. This prohibition created a problem for a society that genuinely needed credit. Farmers needed loans to buy seed before the harvest. Merchants needed capital to finance trading voyages. Kings needed money to fight wars. Without the ability to charge interest, who would provide these loans? Why would anyone lend money if they could not profit from it? One answer was that Jewish communities, not bound by Christian canon law, could serve as money lenders. Throughout medieval Europe, Jewish families filled this economic role, providing credit to Christians who could not obtain it from their fellow believers. This was a vital service, but it came at a terrible social cost. The moneylender is rarely loved, and the association of Jews with usury fueled prejudice and persecution that would scar European history for centuries. It is important to remember that Jewish moneylenders operated under severe constraints. They were often forbidden from owning land or joining trade guilds, leaving finance as one of the few professions open to them. And the interest rates they charged, while sometimes high by modern standards, reflected the genuine risks they faced in a society that might turn against them at any moment. Christian society, meanwhile, developed elaborate ways to provide credit while avoiding the formal prohibition on usury. One common technique was the mortgage, a word that literally means death pledge. A lender would advance money to a landowner and receive the income from a piece of land until the debt was repaid. Since the profit came from the land rather than from the loan itself, this was not technically usury. Another technique was the bill of exchange, which would become one of the most important financial instruments of the medieval period. A bill of exchange was an order to pay a certain sum in a different place, and often in a different currency. A merchant in Florence might give a banker 100 gold florins and receive a bill instructing the banker's correspondent in London to pay an equivalent amount in English pounds. By the time the bill was cashed, the exchange rate might have shifted, and the banker would profit from the difference. Since this profit came from currency exchange rather than from interest on a loan, it did not violate the usury prohibition. These workarounds were sometimes theologically dubious, but they allowed medieval commerce to function. And as trade revived in the 11th and 12th centuries, the demand for such services grew enormously. Perhaps the most remarkable banking institution of the medieval period was one that emerged from an unlikely source, a military religious order dedicated to protecting pilgrims travelling to the Holy Land. The poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, better known as the Knights Templar, would become the most sophisticated bankers in Christendom. The Templars were founded around 1119 in the aftermath of the First Crusade, which had captured Jerusalem for Christian rule. Pilgrims were now flooding to the Holy Land, but the journey was long and dangerous. Bandits preyed on travellers, and the roads between Europe and Jerusalem passed through hostile territory. The Templars began as a small band of knights dedicated to protecting these pilgrims. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience like monks, but they were also warriors. The Pope granted them special privileges, including exemption from local laws and taxes. Donations poured in from pious nobles across Europe, and the order rapidly acquired lands, castles, and wealth. And here is where banking entered the picture. A pilgrim setting out from London or Paris for Jerusalem faced a dilemma. The journey might take months. Carrying enough gold to pay for food, lodging and passage was impractical and dangerous. But how else could the pilgrim access money in distant cities? The Templars offered a solution. A pilgrim could deposit money with the Templars in London at their headquarters in the new temple and receive a letter of credit. When the pilgrim reached Jerusalem, or any point along the way where the Templars had a presence, he could present the letter and receive funds in local currency. The Templars would handle the movement of money themselves through their network of preceptories stretching from Britain to the Holy Land. This was international banking on a scale not seen since Roman times. The Templar network included hundreds of properties across Europe and the Middle East. Their letters of credit were trusted because the order's reputation was beyond question. They were warriors of God, bound by sacred vows, protected by the Pope himself. The Templars offered other financial services as well. They held deposits for safekeeping, including the crown jewels of England and France at various times. They made loans to kings and nobles. They managed estates and collected rents on behalf of clients. The Temple in London and the Temple in Paris became de facto central banks for their respective kingdoms, handling royal finances and storing national treasures. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars were among the most powerful institutions in Christendom, but their very success made them dangerous enemies. In October of 1307, King Philip V of France, deeply in debt to the Templars and coveting their wealth, ordered the arrest of all Templars in France. The charge was heresy. What followed was a travesty of justice. Under torture, some Templars confessed to absurd charges, including worshipping a demon called Baphomet. The Pope, under pressure from the French king, suppressed the order in 1312. The last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314. The Templar wealth was seized, though Philip found far less than he had hoped. Much of the order's property passed to other religious orders or to the crown. The great banking network was dismantled. But the Temple Church in London still stands today, a round church modelled on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, a quiet monument to the knights who once ran one of history's most remarkable financial institutions. Even as the Templars fell, other bankers were rising to take their place. The Italian city-states, particularly Florence, Venice, and Genoa, were emerging as the commercial and financial capitals of Europe, and it was Italian merchants who would develop medieval banking into something approaching its modern form. The Italians had several advantages. Their cities were strategically located at the crossroads of Mediterranean trade. They had strong traditions of commerce and record-keeping, and they were pragmatic about the usury prohibition, developing ever more sophisticated techniques for providing credit while maintaining at least the appearance of theological compliance. Italian bankers became known collectively as Lombards, after the northern Italian region where many originated. They established branches across Europe, and their presence was so pervasive that the main financial street in many cities came to bear their name. Lombard Street in London, to this day one of the centres of British banking, takes its name from the Italian bankers who set up shop there in the 13th century. Among the most successful of these Italian banking families were the Bardi and Peruzzi of Florence. These two houses dominated European finance in the early 14th century, with branches in London, Paris, Bruges, and dozens of other cities. They financed kings and popes, traded wool and grain, and accumulated fortunes that dazzled contemporaries. The Bardi and Peruzzi were particularly close to the English crown. England in the 14th century was a major producer of wool, and the Italian banks controlled much of the wool trade. They advanced money to English kings, often secured against future wool exports. This seemed like a safe arrangement. England's wool clip was predictable and valuable. What could go wrong? What went wrong was Edward III of England. Edward was ambitious and aggressive, determined to pursue his claim to the French throne. This required money, lots of money to hire soldiers and fund campaigns. The Italian banks lent freely, confident that the English king would repay when victory came. Victory did not come, or at least not quickly enough. The 100 Years' War dragged on, consuming money faster than anyone had anticipated. Edward's debts mounted, and in the early 1340s the English king defaulted. The amounts involved were staggering. The Bardi alone were owed more than 900,000 gold florins, a sum equivalent to the entire annual income of the English crown. The Peruzzi were owed nearly as much. When it became clear that these debts would never be fully repaid, both houses collapsed. The failure of the Bardi and Peruzzi sent shockwaves through the European economy. Other banks that had lent to them or relied on them went down in turn. Trade contracted. Credit dried up. Combined with the catastrophic arrival of the Black Death in 1348, the mid-14th century was a period of profound economic disruption. Yet the banking system did not die. Other families stepped into the void left by the Bardi and Peruzzi. Lessons were learned about the dangers of lending too much to any single borrower, even a king. And the techniques that the Italian bankers had developed, the bills of exchange, the double-entry bookkeeping, the branch networks, these survived and continue to evolve. In fact, it was in the records of Italian merchants from this period that we find the earliest examples of what would become the most important innovation in accounting history. Double-entry bookkeeping, the system of recording every transaction as both a debit and a credit, was already being used in Florentine and Venetian counting houses by the late 13th century. It would be formally described and popularized in the following century, providing businesses with a powerful tool for tracking their affairs. The medieval period in banking ended, as it had begun, with crisis and renewal. The great houses fell, but new ones rose. The methods they had pioneered spread and improved. The seeds they planted would flower in the Renaissance, when banking would reach heights of sophistication and influence that the money changers of Rome and Athens could never have imagined. And through it all, in the quiet lanes of medieval cities, the essential work continued. Merchants needed to move money safely. Pilgrims needed to access funds in distant places. Kings needed to finance their ambitions. And bankers, whether Templars in their round churches or Lombards in their counting houses, found ways to meet these needs. From the ashes of the great medieval banking houses, new institutions would rise. The collapse of the Bardi and Peruzzi had been devastating, but it had not destroyed the conditions that made banking necessary. Trade still flowed through Italian ports. Merchants still needed credit. Popes and princes still required financial services. And in Florence, the city that had given birth to those fallen giants, a new family was quietly building something that would surpass them all. The Medici name has become synonymous with Renaissance Florence, with art and architecture and political power. We remember them as patrons of Botticelli and Michelangelo, as the family that produced popes and queens. But before they were any of these things, they were bankers. And it was banking that lifted them from obscurity to become the most influential family in Europe. The Medici origins were humble. They came from the Mugello Valley north of Florence, probably minor landowners, or perhaps, as their name suggests, physicians. The family had lived in Florence for generations before achieving any particular prominence. Some Medici were involved in banking and commerce, but they were not among the city's leading families. Everything changed with Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, born around 1360. Giovanni was not the eldest son, not the heir to whatever modest family fortune existed. He had to make his own way in the world, and he chose banking. Giovanni learned the trade working for a relative who managed the Rome branch of another Florentine bank. Rome was a good place to learn banking because Rome was where the money was. The papal court was the largest financial institution in Christendom, collecting taxes and tithes from across Europe, dispensing funds for churches and crusades, managing an enormous bureaucracy. A banker who could win papal business could become very wealthy indeed. Giovanni proved capable and trustworthy. He rose through the ranks, eventually taking over the Rome branch, and then, in 1397, establishing his own independent bank. This is the date traditionally given for the founding of the Medici Bank, though in truth it grew gradually from Giovanni's earlier work. The key to Giovanni's success was his relationship with the papacy. He became the primary banker of the papal court, handling the enormous sums that flowed to and from Rome. This was immensely lucrative, but it required delicate management. Popes could be demanding clients, and papal politics were treacherous. Giovanni navigated these waters with skill, maintaining good relations with successive pontiffs, while avoiding the factional conflicts that destroyed so many Roman careers. Giovanni also established a reputation for prudence and reliability. He did not chase risky ventures or lend recklessly to monarchs who might not repay. He kept careful books, maintained adequate reserves, and built his fortune steadily rather than spectacularly. By the time of his death in 1429, he was one of the wealthiest men in Florence. But Giovanni's most important legacy was not his own fortune. It was the advice he gave to his sons. Stay out of the public eye, he counselled. Don't appear to give advice to the government, but wait to be asked. It was advice that would be honoured more in the breach than the observance, particularly by his elder son Cosimo. Cosimo de' Medici, born in 1389, inherited the bank upon his father's death and transformed it into something unprecedented. Where Giovanni had been cautious and self-effacing, Cosimo was ambitious and increasingly visible in Florentine politics. But he was also a brilliant banker, perhaps the most skilled financier of his age. Under Cosimo's leadership, the Medici Bank expanded dramatically. Giovanni had focused primarily on Rome, but Cosimo built a network of branches across Europe. Venice, Milan, Bruges, London, Geneva, each major trading centre had its Medici presence. The bank became truly international, moving money across borders with an efficiency that had not been seen since Roman times. The structure Cosimo devised was ingenious. Each branch was organised as a separate partnership, with its own capital and its own managing partners. The Medici in Florence held a majority stake in each branch, but did not manage them directly. Instead, they selected capable managers, gave them a share of the profits, and held them accountable for results. This structure had several advantages. It limited liability. If a branch failed, as sometimes happened, the losses were contained to that branch rather than bringing down the entire enterprise. It also motivated managers, who worked harder knowing that their own fortunes were tied to their branch's success. The system required excellent communication and oversight. Regular reports flowed from the branches to Florence, where Cosimo and his staff reviewed them carefully. Managers who performed poorly were replaced. Those who succeeded were rewarded and promoted. It was in many ways a modern approach to managing a multinational enterprise. The papal account remained the jewel of the Medici business. Cosimo cultivated his relationship with successive popes, making himself indispensable to papal finances. He handled the transfer of funds across Europe, advanced money when the papal treasury ran short, and collected debts owed to the church. In return, the Medici received handsome fees and, perhaps more importantly, access to information about the affairs of every court in Christendom. Cosimo used his wealth and influence to become the de facto ruler of Florence, though he never held official power. He controlled the Republic through careful management of elections, strategic alliances, and the judicious application of financial pressure. His enemies called him a tyrant. His supporters called him the father of his country. He preferred to work quietly, behind the scenes, following his father's advice even as he violated its spirit. But Cosimo was more than a banker and a politician. He was also one of the great patrons in the history of art. He commissioned buildings from Brunelleschi, sculptures from Donatello, paintings from Fra Angelico. He founded libraries and supported scholars who were recovering the lost texts of classical antiquity. The Renaissance as we know it, that flowering of art and learning that transformed European culture, owes an incalculable debt to Medici money. This connection between banking and culture was not accidental. The wealth that flowed through Florentine banks created a class of patrons who competed to demonstrate their taste and magnificence. Churches, palaces, and public buildings were decorated with works that still draw millions of visitors today. The artists and architects who created these works needed patrons, and the patrons needed the income that banking provided. When Cosimo died in 1464, he was mourned as the greatest citizen Florence had ever produced. The state awarded him the title Pater Patriae, father of his country. His grandson Lorenzo, who had been known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, continued the family's tradition of patronage, though with somewhat less success in banking. The Medici Bank reached its peak under Cosimo and began a slow decline under his successors. Lorenzo was more interested in politics and culture than in the details of banking. He relied on managers who were not always competent or honest. The bank extended too much credit to risky borrowers, including the English crown, which defaulted on its debts much as Edward III had done to the Bardi a century earlier. By the time of Lorenzo's death in 1492, the Medici Bank was in serious trouble. Within 2 years, its branches had closed, and the family had been expelled from Florence. They would return, and Medici would eventually become popes and grand dukes. But their banking days were over. The decline of the Medici Bank held lessons that bankers would learn and forget and learn again over the centuries. Success breeds complacency. The skills that build a fortune are not always passed to the next generation. Lending to kings is profitable until it isn't, and no institution, however powerful, is immune to mismanagement. Yet the techniques the Medici had pioneered outlived their bank. Branch banking, partnership structures, sophisticated accounting, these became standard features of European finance. And the most important innovation of all, the system of double-entry bookkeeping that the Italian bankers had developed, was about to be codified and spread throughout the world. In 1494, just as the Medici Bank was collapsing, a Franciscan friar named Luca Pacioli published a remarkable book. The Summa de Arithmetica, Geometria, Proportioni et Proporzionalità was a comprehensive textbook of mathematics, covering everything from basic arithmetic to algebra and geometry. But the section that would have the greatest impact was a treatise on bookkeeping. Pacioli did not invent double-entry bookkeeping. Merchants in Venice and Florence had been using it for at least 2 centuries. But he was the first to describe the system in print, explaining its principles clearly enough that anyone could learn them. The heart of double-entry bookkeeping is simple and elegant. Every transaction is recorded twice, once as a debit and once as a credit. When a merchant receives cash from a customer, he debits his cash account and credits the customer's account. When he pays for goods, he credits cash and debits his inventory. The 2 sides of every entry must always balance. This might seem like unnecessary duplication, but it serves a crucial purpose. If the books are kept correctly, the total of all debits must equal the total of all credits. Any discrepancy reveals an error, or possibly a fraud. The system is self-checking, making it far more reliable than simpler methods of record-keeping. Double-entry bookkeeping also provides a clear picture of a business's financial position at any moment. The balance sheet, showing assets and liabilities, and the income statement, showing revenues and expenses, both flow naturally from the double-entry system. A merchant could see at a glance whether he was making money or losing it, whether his business was growing or shrinking. Pacioli's book spread the Venetian method of bookkeeping across Europe and eventually around the world. The system he described is still the foundation of accounting today. Every corporation, every government, every organization that keeps financial records uses some version of double-entry bookkeeping. It has been called, with some justification, the most important invention in the history of commerce. As Italian banking reached its zenith and began its decline, a new financial power was emerging north of the Alps. The city of Augsburg in southern Germany had grown wealthy from trade and mining, and it produced a family that would rival the Medici in wealth and exceed them in political influence. The Fuggers were weavers and merchants before they were bankers. Hans Fugger came to Augsburg in the 14th century and built a successful textile business. His descendants expanded into banking, lending to local nobles and trading in silver and copper from the mines of Central Europe. But it was Jakob Fugger, born in 1459, who transformed the family enterprise into something extraordinary. Jakob, known to history as Jakob the Rich, may have been the wealthiest private individual who ever lived. Adjusted for the size of the economy, his fortune dwarfed those of later tycoons like Rockefeller or Carnegie. Jacob's great innovation was to combine banking with mining. He made loans to the Habsburg rulers of Austria and Spain, often secured by the output of their silver and copper mines. He then operated the mines himself, or arranged for their operation, ensuring that he got his money back. This vertical integration of finance and industry gave him enormous leverage. The most famous of Jacob's loans financed nothing less than the election of a Holy Roman Emperor. In 1519, King Charles of Spain wanted to become Emperor Charles V, ruler of the largest domain in Europe. But the position of Holy Roman Emperor was elective, chosen by 7 German princes. These princes expected to be compensated for their votes. Jakob Fugger provided the money, roughly 850,000 florins in loans that paid for bribes, armies, and the various expenses of the campaign. Charles won the election, and Jakob, with typical bluntness, later reminded the emperor exactly who had put him on his throne. The Fuggers reached their peak under Jakob and his nephew Anton, but like the Medici before them, they eventually declined. Loans to the Spanish crown proved increasingly difficult to collect. The religious conflicts of the Reformation disrupted their business. By the 17th century, the Fugger Bank was a shadow of its former self. Yet while it lasted, the Fugger enterprise demonstrated the awesome power that banking could confer. A family of provincial weavers had risen to become kingmakers, their loans determining the fate of nations. The pen with which Jakob Fugger signed a letter of credit was mightier than many swords. Florence and Augsburg, the Medici and the Fugger, these names mark the high point of Renaissance banking. They built institutions of unprecedented sophistication, developed techniques that would endure for centuries, and demonstrated that banking could be a path to power and influence as well as wealth. The buildings they financed still stand, monuments to their taste and ambition. The accounting methods they refined still organize the world's finances, and the lessons they learned about the dangers of overreach and the importance of prudent management would be taught again and again in the centuries to come. The great banking houses of Renaissance Italy had shown what was possible. They had built international networks, developed sophisticated techniques, financed kings and popes, but they remained, at their heart, family enterprises, dependent on the talents and judgment of individual merchants. Something new was stirring in the 17th century, something that would transform banking from a private affair into a public institution. The shift began not in Italy, but in the Low Countries, in the prosperous trading cities of the Netherlands. The Dutch Republic in the early 1600s was one of the wonders of the age. A small nation, barely reclaimed from the sea, had become the commercial centre of Europe. Dutch ships sailed to every corner of the globe. Dutch merchants traded in spices and textiles, in grain and timber, in anything that could be bought and sold at a profit. All this commerce required sophisticated financial services. Amsterdam, the heart of the Dutch trading empire, attracted merchants and money changers from across Europe. But the very success of Dutch trade created problems. With so many different currencies circulating, money changing became chaotic. Coins were clipped, shaved, or counterfeited. Merchants never knew exactly what their money was worth. In 1609, the city of Amsterdam established an institution to solve these problems. The Amsterdamse Wisselbank, or Bank of Amsterdam, was not a bank in the modern sense. It did not make loans to private borrowers. What it did was provide a stable, reliable form of money. Merchants could deposit coins at the Whistle Bank and receive credit in bank money, which was worth a fixed amount of pure silver, regardless of the condition of the physical coins. Payments between merchants could then be made by transferring bank money from one account to another, without any coins changing hands. The bank money was always worth the same, always reliable, always available. The Whistle Bank was a public institution, backed by the credit of the city of Amsterdam. Its deposits were supposedly held in full, 100% reserves, ready to be withdrawn at any time. This made it perhaps the safest bank in Europe. Merchants trusted it implicitly. Bank money traded at a premium over ordinary coins, a testament to its superior reliability. For more than a century, the Bank of Amsterdam served as a pillar of European finance. It demonstrated that a public institution could provide monetary stability in ways that private banks could not, and it suggested a model that other nations would eventually follow, though often with significant modifications. While the Dutch were pioneering public banking, a quieter revolution was underway across the North Sea in England. Here, banking was evolving not through grand institutional design, but through the gradual adaptation of an existing trade. The goldsmiths of London were becoming bankers almost by accident. Goldsmiths had always dealt in precious metals. They bought gold and silver, fashioned it into jewellery and plate, and sold their wares to wealthy customers. This trade required secure storage. A goldsmith's shop needed strong vaults to protect valuable inventory from theft. In the turbulent years of the English Civil War, which raged from 1642 to 1651, Londoners with money faced a problem. Where could they keep it safe? The Tower of London, traditional repository of the royal treasury, was seized by Parliament in 1643, and its contents used to finance the war. The great merchants who had stored money there learned a painful lesson about trusting the state with their wealth. The goldsmiths offered an alternative. Their vaults were secure, their businesses were stable, and they were private citizens, unlikely to be raided by Parliament or King. Wealthy Londoners began depositing their gold and silver with goldsmiths for safekeeping. At first, the goldsmiths simply charged a fee for storage. A merchant would deposit gold, receive a receipt and retrieve his gold later minus the storage charge. This was straightforward, much like the temple banking of ancient Mesopotamia. But the goldsmiths soon noticed something interesting. The gold in their vaults rarely moved. Depositors left their gold for months or years at a time. They came to collect it only occasionally, and increasingly depositors found that they could use their receipts as a form of payment. If a merchant owed money to another merchant, he could simply hand over a goldsmith's receipt. The recipient could redeem the receipt for gold or keep it and use it for his own payments. This was a crucial development. The goldsmith receipts were becoming a form of money. They circulated from hand to hand, accepted by anyone who trusted that the goldsmith would honour them. Paper was beginning to substitute for gold. The goldsmiths took the next logical step. If most of their deposited gold just sat in the vault, why not lend some of it out? A goldsmith might have £100 of gold on deposit, but his customers might only withdraw £5 or £10 in any given period. The rest could be lent to borrowers at interest, earning income that far exceeded the storage fees. This was the birth of fractional reserve banking. The goldsmith no longer kept all his deposits in the vault. He kept only a fraction, enough to meet expected withdrawals, and lent the rest. The deposits remained fully available to their owners, at least in theory. In practice, if all depositors came at once to withdraw their gold, the goldsmith could not possibly pay them. The system worked as long as trust held. Depositors believed their gold was safe. They did not all come to withdraw at once. The goldsmith could meet normal demands while earning handsome profits on his loans. It was a beautiful arrangement, elegant and profitable, dependent entirely on confidence. The goldsmith bankers of London flourished in the decades after the Civil War. Names like Edward Backwell and Francis Child became synonymous with financial reliability. They accepted deposits, made loans, transferred funds between accounts, and issued the paper receipts that were becoming London's everyday money. By the 1660s, goldsmith banking was a sophisticated and essential part of English commerce. But the system had a vulnerability that would soon be exposed. The goldsmith bankers had become important creditors to the English crown. King Charles II, restored to the throne in 1660, was perpetually short of money. Parliament was stingy with taxes, and the king's expenses were large. The goldsmiths lent freely to the crown, confident that the king would repay. In January of 1672, Charles delivered a devastating blow. Facing yet another war with the Dutch and desperately needing cash, he announced the stop of the exchequer. This was a suspension of payments on the crown's debts. The money the goldsmiths had lent to the king would not be repaid, at least not any time soon. The effect was catastrophic. Several major goldsmith bankers failed immediately. Others survived but were badly weakened. The depositors who had trusted them faced the consequences of fractional reserve banking gone wrong. Some lost everything. The stop of the exchequer shook confidence in goldsmith banking, but it did not destroy the industry. The surviving goldsmiths continued their business, more cautiously than before, and within a few decades, a new institution would emerge that would transform English banking forever. The Bank of England was born from war. In the 1690s, England was engaged in a costly struggle against France, the War of the Grand Alliance. King William III, who had taken the English throne in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, needed money to fight. The traditional sources of royal finance were inadequate. Something new was required. A Scottish merchant named William Paterson proposed a solution. A group of investors would lend the government £1,200,000. In return, they would receive interest payments and, crucially, the right to operate as a bank, issuing notes and conducting banking business under a royal charter. Paterson's proposal was accepted. In 1694, the subscribers raised the money in just 12 days, an astonishing demonstration of confidence in the new institution. The Bank of England was born. The bank was not a central bank in the modern sense. It was a private corporation, owned by its shareholders, operated for profit. But from the beginning, it had a special relationship with the government. It managed the national debt, handled government payments, and served as the government's banker. This relationship gave it prestige and stability that no private bank could match. The Bank of England also issued banknotes. These were promises to pay the bearer a certain amount on demand, backed by the bank's reserves and the government's credit. They circulated as money, gradually replacing the goldsmith receipts that had served London for decades. Bank of England notes were widely trusted, and they became the foundation of England's paper money system. The early years of the Bank of England were not without difficulties. It faced runs on its reserves in 1696 and 1745. It had to suspend cash payments briefly during moments of crisis, but it survived, and with each challenge overcome, confidence in the institution grew stronger. One reason for the bank's stability was its cautious approach to lending. Unlike the Goldsmith bankers who had lent recklessly to Charles II, the Bank of England maintained substantial reserves and avoided the most dangerous forms of speculation. It became known for solidity and reliability rather than aggressive profit-seeking. Yet the early 18th century also witnessed one of history's most spectacular financial manias, and the Bank of England played a peripheral role in the drama. The South Sea Bubble of 1720 revealed how quickly confidence could turn to frenzy, and frenzy to panic. The South Sea Company had been founded in 1711, ostensibly to trade with the Spanish colonies in South America. In reality, it was mainly a vehicle for managing government debt. In 1720, the company proposed to take over a large portion of the national debt, issuing its own shares in exchange for government bonds. The scheme caught the public imagination. South Sea Company shares began to rise. As they rose, more people wanted to buy. The price climbed from around £100 in January to over £1,000 by midsummer. Fortunes were made on paper. Servants became rich. Nobles became richer. The frenzy spread beyond the South Sea Company. Dozens of new companies were launched to capitalise on the speculative fever. Some had plausible business plans, others were absurd. One promoter famously raised money for a company whose purpose was described only as an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. The bubble burst in the autumn of 1720. Prices collapsed as rapidly as they had risen. Investors who had borrowed to buy shares were ruined. Banks that had lent against share values faced massive losses. The South Sea Company directors were investigated and punished. The British public learned, not for the last time, that prices can fall as well as rise. The South Sea Bubble left lasting scars on British finance. Parliament passed the Bubble Act, restricting the formation of joint stock companies. For more than a century, British business would be constrained by laws designed to prevent another such mania. Yet the fundamentals of British banking remained sound. The Bank of England survived the crisis relatively unscathed. The Goldsmith bankers, now evolving into private banks with names like Hawes and Childs, continue to serve wealthy clients. And in Scotland, a distinctive banking tradition was developing that would contribute its own innovations. The Bank of Scotland had been founded in 1695, just a year after its English counterpart. The Royal Bank of Scotland followed in 1727. These Scottish banks operated in a different legal environment than English banks, with greater freedom to experiment. One Scottish innovation proved particularly important. The cash credit account, pioneered by the Royal Bank of Scotland, allowed customers to borrow up to a specified limit, paying interest only on the amount actually used. This was the ancestor of the modern overdraft facility, a flexible form of credit that proved enormously useful for merchants and farmers who needed money at unpredictable times. Scottish banks also pioneered branch banking within Britain. While English banking remained concentrated in London, with country banks operating independently, Scottish banks established networks of branches that allowed them to serve customers throughout the nation. This model would eventually spread worldwide. By the middle of the 18th century, the foundations of modern banking had been laid. Public institutions like the Bank of England provided monetary stability and managed government finances. Private banks served merchants, landowners, and the growing middle class. Paper money, backed by bank reserves and government credit, circulated alongside gold and silver coins. The old world of the Goldsmith bankers was passing. The new world of chartered banks, central banks, and paper money was taking shape. It was a world built on confidence, on the collective belief that a piece of paper could be worth a piece of gold. That confidence could be shaken, as the South Sea bubble had shown. But when it held, it made possible forms of commerce and industry that hard money alone could never have sustained. Across the Atlantic, a new nation was about to grapple with these same questions. What role should government play in banking? How should paper money be managed? Who should control the creation of credit? The American experiment in banking was about to begin, and it would raise these issues with a passion and urgency all its own. The banking systems of Britain and Europe had developed over centuries, shaped by tradition and gradual reform. Across the Atlantic, a new nation was forming that would have the opportunity to build its financial institutions from scratch. The United States of America, born in revolution, would approach the question of banking with the same passion and philosophical intensity that had animated its struggle for independence. Colonial America had always faced a shortage of money. The British colonies were not permitted to mint their own coins, and hard currency tended to flow back to England to pay for imported goods. Colonists improvised. They used Spanish dollars, Dutch guilders, whatever foreign coins came their way. They used tobacco as currency in Virginia and wampum beads in New England. They experimented with paper money issued by colonial governments, sometimes successfully, often disastrously. When the Revolution came, the Continental Congress faced the problem that had plagued governments since ancient times: how to pay for a war. The solution was paper money. Congress issued continental dollars, promising to redeem them eventually in hard currency. By the war's end, it had printed roughly $240 million worth. The result was predictable. As the supply of continentals grew, their value fell. By 1781, they were practically worthless. Not worth a continental became an American idiom for something utterly valueless. The experience left deep scars on the American psyche, a distrust of paper money that would influence debates for generations. When the war ended and the Constitution was ratified, the new federal government inherited a financial mess. The Continental Congress had accumulated enormous debts. The states had debts of their own. The nation's credit was in tatters. Something had to be done, and the man who would do it was Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was an unlikely figure to become America's financial architect. Born out of wedlock in the Caribbean island of Nevis around 1755, he had arrived in New York as a teenager, worked his way through King's College, and become one of George Washington's most trusted aides during the Revolution. He was brilliant, ambitious, and utterly convinced that America needed a strong central government with sound finances. As the first Secretary of the Treasury, appointed in 1789, Hamilton submitted a series of reports to Congress that laid out his vision for American finance. The federal government would assume the debts of the states, consolidating them into a single national debt. This debt would be funded through tariffs and taxes, establishing the nation's credit. And at the centre of the system would be a national bank. Hamilton's proposed Bank of the United States was modelled partly on the Bank of England. It would be a private corporation with a public purpose. The government would own 1/5 of its shares. It would serve as the government's banker, holding deposits and making payments. It would issue banknotes that would circulate as currency. And it would provide credit to merchants and businesses, stimulating economic growth. The proposal ignited fierce opposition, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Jefferson, who would later become the third president, saw the bank as unconstitutional, corrupt, and dangerous. The Constitution, he argued, did not explicitly grant Congress the power to create a bank. The bank would concentrate financial power in the hands of wealthy speculators. It would favour the commercial interests of the North over the agricultural interests of the South. Behind these specific objections lay a deeper philosophical divide. Hamilton envisioned an America of commerce and industry, with a strong central government supporting economic development. Jefferson dreamed of an America of independent farmers, suspicious of concentrated power in any form. The bank became a symbol of this fundamental disagreement about what kind of nation America would become. President Washington listened to both sides and ultimately sided with Hamilton. The Bank of the United States received its charter in 1791, authorized to operate for 20 years. It was headquartered in Philadelphia, then the nation's capital, and quickly established branches in major cities. The first Bank of the United States was, by most measures, a success. It provided a stable currency. It facilitated government finances. It supported the growing economy. Its notes circulated widely and retained their value. The fears of its opponents did not materialize. The Republic did not collapse into tyranny. But the opposition never disappeared. When the bank's charter came up for renewal in 1811, the political landscape had shifted. The Federalists who had supported Hamilton were fading. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans controlled Congress. The renewal failed by a single vote in both the House and the Senate. The first Bank of the United States closed its doors. The timing was unfortunate. Within a year, the United States was at war with Britain again, the War of 1812. Without a national bank to help finance the conflict and stabilize the currency, the government struggled. State banks issued their own notes in bewildering variety. Inflation soared. The financial chaos that Hamilton had sought to prevent returned with a vengeance. By the time the war ended, even many former opponents of the bank had changed their minds. In 1816, Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States, with a structure similar to its predecessor. The new bank was larger, with $35 million in capital, and was authorized for another 20 years. The second bank started poorly. Its early leadership was weak, and the bank contributed to a speculative boom that ended in the Panic of 1819. But under new management, particularly the presidency of Nicholas Biddle beginning in 1823, the bank found its footing. Biddle was a Philadelphia aristocrat, cultured and confident, convinced that he could manage the American economy through skillful central banking. Under his leadership, the second bank became a powerful institution. It regulated the state banks by presenting their notes for redemption, forcing them to maintain adequate reserves. It provided a uniform national currency. It smoothed the ups and downs of the business cycle. To many Americans, Biddle's bank was exactly what the country needed, a stabilizing force in a chaotic financial landscape. To others, it was a monster, an undemocratic concentration of power that threatened liberty itself. The stage was set for one of the great political battles in American history. Andrew Jackson, elected president in 1828, was the champion of the common man, a frontier hero who despised the Eastern elite and everything it represented. He hated banks in general and the Bank of the United States in particular. "The bank is trying to kill me," he reportedly said, "but I will kill it." In 1832, 4 years before its charter was due to expire, the bank's supporters pushed a recharter bill through Congress. They hoped to make the bank an issue in that year's presidential election, confident that the public would support the institution. It was a fatal miscalculation. Jackson vetoed the bill with a message that became one of the most famous presidential documents in American history. He denounced the bank as unconstitutional, as a tool of the wealthy, as a threat to democracy. "It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes," he wrote. The veto was sustained. The bank would die. Jackson won re-election overwhelmingly. He then went further, ordering the removal of federal deposits from the bank and their distribution to selected state banks, which his critics called pet banks. Biddle fought back, contracting credit in an attempt to create economic distress that would force the government to reverse course. The tactic backfired. Public opinion turned against the bank. Its charter expired in 1836, and the Second Bank of the United States passed into history. The destruction of the bank left the United States without any central financial institution. What followed was the free banking era, a quarter-century of experimentation and chaos that demonstrated both the creativity and the dangers of unregulated finance. Beginning in 1837, states began passing free banking laws that allowed anyone meeting minimal requirements to open a bank and issue currency. The theory was that competition would keep banks honest and efficient. The practice was rather different. Thousands of banks sprang up across the country. Each issued its own notes, its own paper money, in its own designs. A merchant in New York might receive payment in the notes of banks in Indiana, Georgia, and Michigan, each of uncertain value. Detecting counterfeits was difficult when there were so many legitimate designs to begin with. Some of these banks were sound institutions, well managed and adequately capitalized. Others were wildcat banks, established in remote locations where redeeming notes for gold or silver was virtually impossible. The name supposedly came from the practice of setting up banks in places so wild that only wildcats lived there. A traveller seeking to redeem notes might arrive at the bank's supposed location to find nothing but wilderness. The value of banknotes varied depending on distance from the issuing bank, the bank's reputation, and shifting perceptions of its soundness. Merchants needed publications called banknote reporters that listed current exchange rates for hundreds of different currencies. A dollar was not simply a dollar. It was a dollar from a particular bank, worth more or less than a dollar from another bank. The free banking era also saw repeated financial panics. The Panic of 1837, coming just after Jackson's bank war, triggered a severe depression. The Panic of 1857 brought another wave of bank failures. Without a central institution to provide stability or act as a lender of last resort, the banking system lurched from crisis to crisis. The Civil War finally forced a change. The Union government, desperate for money to fight the Confederacy, needed a more reliable financial system. In 1863 and 1864, Congress passed the National Banking Acts, creating a new framework for American banking. The National Banking Acts established federally chartered banks called national banks, which would operate under uniform regulations and issue a uniform national currency. State banks could continue to exist, but their notes were taxed out of existence, forcing them to convert to national charters or to conduct business without issuing currency. The new system was an improvement over the chaos that preceded it. The national banknotes were uniform and reliable. The wildcat banks disappeared. The bewildering variety of currencies gave way to something more orderly. But the system had flaws. There was still no central bank to manage the money supply or respond to crises. The amount of national banknotes in circulation was tied to government bonds, not to the needs of the economy. Credit was abundant in some regions and scarce in others, and without a lender of last resort, panics could still spiral out of control. The Panic of 1873 demonstrated these weaknesses painfully. A major investment bank, J. Cook and Company, failed in September of that year, triggering a cascade of failures. The New York Stock Exchange closed for 10 days. Banks across the country collapsed. The depression that followed lasted 5 years and brought widespread unemployment and suffering. The pattern would repeat in 1884, 1890, and 1893. Each panic exposed the same fundamental problem. America's banking system had no mechanism for responding to crises. When confidence faltered and depositors rushed to withdraw their money, there was no institution with the resources and authority to stem the tide. The debates that Hamilton and Jefferson had conducted at the nation's founding continued in new forms. Should the government play an active role in banking and finance, or should the market be left to regulate itself? Americans remained deeply divided, their attitudes shaped by regional interests, economic philosophies, and memories of past abuses. By the end of the 19th century, it was becoming clear that something would have to change. The American economy had grown enormously. Industry and commerce operated on a scale that the founders could never have imagined. The financial system that had sufficed for a nation of farmers was straining under the demands of an industrial power. A new crisis would soon force the issue, and it would take a private banker, acting with resources and authority that no individual should have possessed, to convince America that it finally needed a central bank. The age of the Titans was about to begin. The recurring panics of the late 19th century had exposed a dangerous gap in American finance. There was no institution with the power to stabilize the system when confidence failed. Into this void stepped a generation of private bankers whose wealth and influence exceeded anything the nation had seen before. They were the titans of Wall Street, and for a brief but remarkable period, one man among them would serve as America's unofficial central banker. John Pierpont Morgan was born in 1837 into a family already established in international finance. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was a partner in a prominent London banking house. Young Pierpont, as he was known, grew up surrounded by wealth and commerce, educated in Europe, trained in the ways of high finance from an early age. Morgan entered banking in the 1850s, and over the following decades built an empire. His firm, which would eventually become J.P. Morgan and Company, specialized in the kind of banking that had emerged in the industrial age. This was not the deposit-taking and lending of ordinary commercial banks. This was investment banking, the business of raising capital for railroads and steel mills and industrial corporations, of organizing mergers and reorganizations, of transforming the American economy through the sheer force of financial power, Morgan was instrumental in consolidating American industry. He reorganized railroads, bringing order to a chaotic network of competing lines. He helped create United States Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in history. He assembled General Electric. Companies that came under his influence were said to be Morganized, restructured according to his principles of efficiency and controlled competition. With this industrial power came financial power. Morgan's firm sat at the center of an intricate web of relationships connecting banks, insurance companies, railroads, and industrial corporations. His partners served on the boards of dozens of major companies. His approval was needed for major financial transactions. His word could make or break careers, companies, even markets. Morgan was not loved. His jowly face, disfigured by a skin condition that left his nose swollen and purple, appeared in hostile cartoons as the embodiment of plutocratic greed. Reformers denounced him as a monopolist who strangled competition and exploited workers, but even his critics acknowledged his power. When financial crises struck, it was Morgan to whom the nation turned. The Panic of 1907 was the crisis that would cement Morgan's legend and ultimately convince America that it could no longer rely on private bankers to stabilize its financial system. The panic began in October of that year with the failure of a speculative scheme to corner the copper market. The speculators had borrowed heavily from banks and trust companies, and when their scheme collapsed, their creditors faced massive losses. Depositors at the affected institutions rushed to withdraw their money. The panic spread from bank to bank, trust company to trust company, as fear proved contagious. By late October, the situation was desperate. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the largest trust companies in New York, had been forced to close its doors. Other trust companies were besieged by depositors demanding their money. The stock market was seizing up, with brokers unable to borrow the funds they needed to settle trades. The entire financial system seemed on the verge of collapse. At 70 years old, Morgan took command. He summoned the leading bankers of New York to his private library, a magnificent building on Madison Avenue filled with rare books and Renaissance art. There, in a room lined with priceless manuscripts, the fate of American finance would be decided. Morgan organized a rescue. He determined which institutions were fundamentally sound and deserving of support, and which were too far gone to save. He pressured the healthy banks to contribute to a pool of funds that would provide liquidity to the system. He persuaded the Treasury Secretary to deposit government money in New York banks. He arranged for the leading trust company presidents to commit their resources to the rescue effort. The story goes that Morgan locked the trust company presidents in his library one night, refusing to let them leave until they agreed to contribute $25 million to save the weakest institutions. Whether literally true or not, the image captures the essence of Morgan's method. Through sheer force of personality and financial leverage, he imposed cooperation on a fractious industry. The rescue worked. The panic subsided. The financial system stabilized. Morgan had saved American finance through the exercise of private power without any assistance from government institutions that did not exist. But the experience was sobering. The nation had been saved by the judgment and resources of one elderly man. What would happen when Morgan was gone? Was it acceptable in a democracy for so much power to rest in private hands? The Panic of 1907 convinced many Americans that the time had finally come for a proper central bank. Morgan himself died in 1913. just as the institution that would succeed him was being born. The creation of the Federal Reserve is one of the strangest stories in American financial history, involving a secret meeting on a remote island and a cast of characters who seem to emerge from a novel. In November of 1910, a small group of men gathered at a railroad station in New Jersey. They travelled by private railcar to the coast of Georgia, then by boat to Jekyll Island, an exclusive resort owned by a group of the nation's wealthiest families. They registered under false names and spoke only first names to avoid recognition by the servants. The secrecy was essential because the purpose of their meeting was to design a central bank for the United States. The group included Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, one of the most powerful politicians in Washington, and father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr. It included Henry Davison and Benjamin Strong of the Morgan banking empire. It included Paul Warburg, a German-born banker who had long advocated for an American central bank modelled on European examples. It included several other bankers and treasury officials. For 9 days, these men worked in secret, designing the institution that would become the Federal Reserve. They emerged with a plan for a central bank that would be neither fully public nor fully private, a compromise between the Hamiltonian vision of a strong central institution and the Jeffersonian suspicion of concentrated financial power. The plan called for a system of regional reserve banks, owned by the commercial banks in each region, coordinated by a central board in Washington appointed by the president. The reserve banks would hold reserves for commercial banks, issue a new national currency, and act as lender of last resort during panics. It was a distinctively American solution, decentralized enough to calm fears of money trusts, while centralized enough to provide genuine stability. The path from Jekyll Island to law was not straightforward. The Aldrich Plan, as it was initially called, faced fierce opposition from progressives who saw it as a banker's scheme. A revised version, the Federal Reserve Act, was passed by Congress and signed by President Woodrow Wilson in December of 1913. The Federal Reserve System opened for business in November of 1914, just as war was breaking out in Europe. The early Federal Reserve were a work in progress, its powers and practices evolving through experience. The war years required it to support government borrowing on an unprecedented scale. The post-war period brought inflation, then a sharp recession in 1920 and 21. The Fed was learning its role, sometimes stumbling, gradually developing the tools and techniques of central banking. The 1920s are remembered as a time of prosperity and optimism. The Roaring Twenties, an era of jazz and flappers and seemingly endless economic expansion. The stock market rose year after year. New industries like automobiles and radio transformed daily life. Consumer credit expanded, allowing ordinary Americans to buy refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, and Model T Fords on installment plans. Banking flourished in this environment. The number of banks in the United States peaked at nearly 30,000 in the early 20s. Commercial banks made loans for homes and farms, for businesses and consumer purchases. Investment banks underwrote securities for a public eager to participate in the boom. The line between commercial banking and investment banking blurred as banks sought new ways to profit from the expanding economy. The stock market became a national obsession. Americans who had never owned a share of stock opened brokerage accounts and placed orders. They borrowed money to buy stocks, a practice called buying on margin. A speculator might put up only 10% of a stock's purchase price, borrowing the rest from his broker. If the stock rose, his profits were multiplied tenfold. If it fell, he could lose everything and more. The Federal Reserve watched with growing concern. Some Fed officials worried that too much credit was flowing into stock speculation rather than productive enterprise. In 1928 and 1929, the Fed raised interest rates, hoping to cool the speculative fever without triggering a crash. It was a delicate operation, and the Fed was not yet skilled in such maneuvers. The crash came in October of 1929. On Thursday, October 24th, a wave of selling sent prices tumbling. Bankers organized a pool to support the market, and for a few days it seemed the crisis might pass. But on Monday, October 28th, prices fell sharply again. The next day, Black Tuesday, October 29th, was the worst single day in stock market history to that point. 16 million shares changed hands as panic gripped Wall Street. The crash wiped out fortunes. Speculators who had bought on margin were ruined. But the crash itself, however dramatic, was only the beginning. The real catastrophe unfolded over the following years as the crash triggered a chain of failures that brought down the entire banking system. The mechanism was tragically simple. Banks had lent money for stock speculation. When the market crashed, those loans went bad. Banks had also invested in bonds that declined in value. As bank assets shrank, depositors grew nervous. They began to withdraw their money, seeking the safety of cash. When too many depositors withdraw at once, even a healthy bank can fail. The bank's assets, its loans and investments, cannot be liquidated instantly at full value. If the bank must sell assets quickly to meet withdrawals, it takes losses. These losses erode its capital, making depositors even more nervous. The bank run becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Between 1930 and 1933, approximately 9,000 American banks failed. Roughly 1/3 of all the banks in the country simply vanished, taking their depositors' savings with them. There was no deposit insurance. If your bank failed, your money was gone. The human cost was enormous. Life savings disappeared overnight. Farmers lost their land. Businesses closed. Unemployment reached nearly 25% by 1933. Breadlines formed in cities across the nation. The Great Depression, as it came to be called, was the worst economic catastrophe in American history. The Federal Reserve failed to respond adequately. Some historians argue that the Fed actually made things worse by allowing the money supply to contract when it should have been expanding. The central bank that had been created to prevent panics instead presided over the greatest panic of all. By the time Franklin Roosevelt took office in March of 1933, the banking system had essentially ceased to function. On his very first day as president, Roosevelt declared a national bank holiday, closing every bank in the country. It was a dramatic step, but a necessary one. The banking system needed to be restructured before it could reopen. The reforms that followed reshaped American banking for generations. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 separated commercial banking from investment banking. Banks that took deposits and made loans could no longer underwrite securities or engage in speculative activities. The logic was simple. If deposit-taking banks were insulated from Wall Street speculation, they would be less likely to fail. Even more important was the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC. This new agency guaranteed bank deposits up to a limit of $2,500 initially, later increased many times. If your bank failed, the government would make sure you got your money back. Deposit insurance transformed American banking. The incentive for bank runs disappeared. Why rush to withdraw your money if the government guaranteed it anyway? The self-fulfilling prophecies that had destroyed thousands of banks could no longer take hold. Banking became stable in a way it had never been before. The banks reopened after Roosevelt's holiday, examined and certified as sound. Confidence slowly returned. The Depression did not end quickly, and its scars would last for decades. But the banking system that emerged from the crisis was stronger and safer than what had come before. The reforms of the 1930s represented a fundamental shift in American attitudes toward banking. The laissez-faire approach of the free banking era was gone. In its place was a system of government supervision, deposit insurance, and Federal Reserve oversight. The titans of Wall Street remained powerful, but they now operated within constraints that previous generations would have found unimaginable. Morgan's library still stands on Madison Avenue, a museum now, its treasures open to the public. The building is a monument to an age when private power could stabilize or shake an entire economy. That age was passing. The future would belong to institutions rather than individuals, to regulators rather than titans. The reforms that followed the Great Depression had stabilized American banking, but they were only part of a larger reconstruction of the global financial system. The Second World War, even more devastating than the First, would ultimately give rise to a new international order designed to prevent the economic chaos that had helped bring fascism to power. And within this framework, banking would enter what many would later remember as a golden age. As the war drew toward its close in the summer of 1944, representatives of 44 Allied nations gathered at a resort hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire. The Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods was an unlikely setting for one of the most important financial conferences in history. But for 3 weeks in July, economists and diplomats worked to design a system that would govern international finance for decades to come. The Bretton Woods system, as it came to be, known established fixed exchange rates among the major currencies. The United States dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies were pegged to the dollar. This arrangement provided the stability that international trade required while avoiding the rigidities that had made the old gold standard so problematic. 2 new international institutions were created at Bretton Woods. The International Monetary Fund would maintain the system of fixed exchange rates, lending to countries that faced temporary balance of payments difficulties. The World Bank would provide longer-term financing for reconstruction and development, together with the dollar's role as the anchor currency. These institutions form the architecture of post-war international finance. For the banking industry, the decades following the war were a time of steady growth and remarkable stability. The Glass-Steagall separation between commercial and investment banking remained in place. Deposit insurance protected savers. The Federal Reserve had learned from its Depression-era failures and now managed the money supply more skillfully. Bank failures, which had numbered in the thousands during the early 30s, became rare events. But perhaps the most significant development in post-war banking was not on Wall Street or in the corridors of the Federal Reserve. It was in the daily lives of ordinary Americans who were developing a new relationship with banks and credit that would have astonished earlier generations. Before the war, most Americans had limited contact with the banking system. They might have a savings account, perhaps a mortgage if they owned a home. But consumer credit was relatively rare, and the idea of borrowing for everyday purchases was viewed with suspicion. Debt was something to be avoided, a sign of financial weakness or moral failing. The post-war decades transformed these attitudes. The returning soldiers needed homes, and banks were eager to provide mortgages backed by government guarantees. The suburbs expanded, and with them the demand for automobiles, appliances, and all the accoutrements of middle-class life. Banks discovered that lending to consumers could be just as profitable as lending to businesses, and far less risky when spread across millions of small loans. One innovation in particular would revolutionize the relationship between banks and consumers. In 1950, a businessman named Frank McNamara found himself at a New York restaurant without enough cash to pay his bill. The embarrassing incident inspired an idea. What if there were a card that allowed people to charge purchases and pay later? McNamara and his partners launched the Diners Club card later that year. It was not technically a bank product. Cardholders paid an annual fee and were expected to pay their balance in full each month. Merchants paid a percentage of each transaction to Diners Club. The concept was simple, but it introduced millions of Americans to the convenience of paying without cash. Banks quickly saw the potential. In 1958, Bank of America launched the Bank AmeriCard in California. Unlike Diners Club, the Bank AmeriCard allowed holders to carry a balance from month to month, paying interest on what they owed. This was revolving credit, and it proved enormously popular. The Bank AmeriCard would eventually become Visa, one of the most recognized brands in the world. Other banks followed with their own cards. A group of California banks created MasterCharge, which would become MasterCard. American Express, originally a freight company, launched its own charge card. By the 1970s, credit cards had become a normal part of American life, accepted at restaurants, gas stations, department stores, and eventually almost everywhere. The credit card changed not just how people paid, but how they thought about money. The psychological barrier between wanting something and buying something became thinner. The discipline of saving before purchasing gave way to the convenience of purchasing now and paying later. Whether this was liberation or temptation depended on one's perspective, but there was no denying that consumer behavior had fundamentally changed. Another innovation was making banking more convenient in a different way. In the late 1960s, banks began experimenting with machines that could dispense cash automatically without requiring a human teller. The first modern automated teller machine, or ATM, is generally credited to Barclays Bank, which installed one at a branch in North London in June of 1967. The early ATMs were simple devices, dispensing fixed amounts of cash to customers who inserted special vouchers. But the technology evolved rapidly. By the 1980s, ATMs could accept deposits, transfer funds between accounts, and provide account information. Networks linked machines from different banks, allowing customers to access their money almost anywhere. The ATM represented a subtle but significant shift in banking. For centuries, banking had been a relationship between people. You knew your banker, and your banker knew you. The teller who cashed your check recognized your face. Banking hours were limited, and transactions required human interaction. The ATM began the process of disintermediation, removing the human middleman from routine transactions. It was faster and more convenient, but it also made banking more impersonal. The relationship that had once existed between banker and customer was gradually being replaced by a relationship between customer and machine. While consumer banking was being transformed, the international system established at Bretton Woods was showing signs of strain. The arrangement had always depended on confidence in the dollar and in America's willingness to exchange dollars for gold at the fixed price of $35 per ounce. By the late 1960s, that confidence was eroding. The United States was running persistent trade deficits, sending more dollars abroad than it was receiving. Foreign governments accumulated these dollars and began to question whether America really had enough gold to back them all. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, pointedly exchanged its dollar reserves for gold, draining American gold stocks. The tension came to a head in August of 1971. President Richard Nixon, facing a run on American gold reserves, announced that the United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold. The gold window was closed. The Bretton Woods system, which had governed international finance for a quarter century, was effectively over. What followed was a period of adjustment as the world moved to floating exchange rates. Currencies now rose and fell against each other based on market forces rather than government pegs. This created new risks for businesses engaged in international trade, but also new opportunities for banks that could help manage those risks. The 1970s were turbulent years for the global economy. Oil price shocks sent inflation soaring. Interest rates reached levels not seen in generations. The comfortable stability of the post-war decades gave way to uncertainty and volatility. Banking adapted to these new conditions. The high interest rates of the late 70s and early 80s created particular problems for a category of institutions called savings and loan associations, or thrifts. These institutions had traditionally focused on mortgage lending, accepting deposits, and making long-term home loans at fixed interest rates. The business model worked well when interest rates were stable, but when rates rose sharply, the thrifts found themselves in trouble. They were paying high interest rates to attract deposits while earning low interest rates on mortgages made years earlier. Many were losing money on every transaction. Deregulation was offered as a solution. In the early 1980s, laws were changed to allow thrifts to make riskier investments, competing with commercial banks in areas that had previously been off limits. The theory was that new opportunities would help the struggling institutions recover. Instead, deregulation led to disaster. Many thrift managers, inexperienced in commercial lending, made bad loans. Some engaged in outright fraud. By the late 1980s, hundreds of savings and loans were failing. The government insurance fund that protected depositors was overwhelmed. The eventual cost to taxpayers exceeded $150 billion. The savings and loan crisis was a painful reminder that financial deregulation carried risks as well as benefits. But the momentum toward deregulation continued. The barriers that had separated different types of financial institutions since the 1930s were gradually being dismantled. The culmination came in 1999 with the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which formally repealed the Glass-Steagall separation between commercial and investment banking. Banks could now engage in the full range of financial activities, from taking deposits to underwriting securities to selling insurance. The walls that had been erected after the Great Depression came tumbling down. Supporters argued that the old distinctions no longer made sense in a modern financial system. Banks needed to compete with other financial institutions that faced fewer restrictions. Consumers would benefit from one-stop shopping for all their financial needs. The risks that had motivated Glass-Steagall could be managed through modern risk management techniques. The repeal enabled a wave of consolidation that created financial institutions of unprecedented size and complexity. Citigroup, formed through this merger of Citicorp and Travelers Group, became a financial supermarket offering banking, insurance and investment services under one roof. JP Morgan Chase assembled itself through a series of mergers, combining some of the most storied names in American banking. Bank of America expanded through acquisitions to become one of the largest banks in the world. These global megabanks operated on a scale that would have astonished earlier generations of bankers. They had trillions of dollars in assets, hundreds of thousands of employees, operations in dozens of countries. They were too big to fail, as the phrase went, meaning that their collapse would threaten the entire financial system. Another transformation was occurring in how banks made loans. Traditionally, when a bank made a mortgage loan, it kept that loan on its books until it was repaid. The bank bore the risk that the borrower might default. This made banks careful about whom they lent to and on what terms. Securitization changed this model. Banks discovered they could bundle mortgages together and sell them to investors as securities. The bank would make the loan, collect a fee, then sell the loan to someone else. The risk was transferred. The bank no longer needed to worry whether the borrower would repay. This seemed like a clever innovation, spreading risk across a broader base of investors and freeing up bank capital to make more loans. Mortgage-backed securities became a major market, attracting investors from around the world seeking the steady returns that American homeowners' monthly payments provided. But securitization also created problems. If banks didn't bear the risk of default, they had less incentive to ensure that borrowers could actually repay. The careful assessment of creditworthiness that had characterized traditional banking began to erode. Loans were made to borrowers who, under the old system, would never have qualified. By the early 2000s, the financial system had become vastly more complex than anything that had existed before. Traditional banking, with its deposits and loans and careful relationships, had been supplemented by a shadow banking system of securities, derivatives, and complex financial instruments that few people fully understood. The innovations had brought benefits. Credit was more widely available. Consumers had access to services that earlier generations could not have imagined. The financial system was more efficient in many ways, allocating capital more quickly and flexibly than the stodgy banks of the post-war era. But risks had also accumulated. The safeguards that had been put in place after the Great Depression had been weakened or removed. The assumption that modern risk management could handle any challenge had not been tested by a genuine crisis. The next chapter of banking history would put that assumption to the test. The complexity that had accumulated in the financial system through the 1990s and early 2000s contained risks that few fully appreciated. The innovations in securitization and derivatives had created intricate webs of connection between institutions around the world. A problem in one corner of the system could spread with terrifying speed to every other corner. And in the summer of 2007, a problem began to emerge. It started in the American housing market. For years, home prices had been rising, fueled by easy credit and the widespread belief that real estate was a safe investment. Lenders had extended mortgages to borrowers with poor credit histories, loans that came to be known as subprime mortgages. These loans often featured low initial payments that would reset to much higher levels after a few years. The assumption was that rising home prices would allow borrowers to refinance before the higher payments kicked in. When home prices stopped rising and began to fall, that assumption proved catastrophic. Borrowers who could not afford their higher payments and could not refinance began to default. The securities backed by these mortgages, which had been sold to investors around the world, began to lose value. And because those securities were held by banks and other financial institutions, losses spread throughout the system. At first, the problem seemed contained. A few hedge funds failed. Some mortgage lenders went bankrupt. Officials expressed confidence that the difficulties were limited to a small corner of the market. But as 2007 turned to 2008, the troubles deepened. In March of 2008, Bear Stearns, one of Wall Street's oldest investment banks, found itself unable to meet its obligations. The firm had invested heavily in mortgage-backed securities and now faced a crisis of confidence. Creditors and trading partners were refusing to do business with it. The Federal Reserve arranged an emergency sale to J.P. Morgan Chase, providing financing to make the deal possible. Bear Stearns vanished, absorbed into a larger institution. The Bear Stearns rescue seemed to stabilize the situation temporarily. But over the summer, conditions continued to deteriorate. Home prices kept falling. Mortgage defaults kept rising. The securities backed by those mortgages kept losing value, and the institutions holding those securities found their capital eroding. September of 2008 brought the crisis to its peak. Lehman Brothers, an investment bank even larger and more venerable than Bear Stearns, faced the same pressures. Its holdings of mortgage-related assets had left it deeply exposed. Potential buyers backed away. The government, which had arranged Bear Stearns' rescue, decided this time not to intervene. On September 15, 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. It was the largest bankruptcy in American history, with over $600 billion in assets. The failure sent shockwaves through the global financial system. Institutions that had done business with Lehman faced sudden losses. Credit markets froze as lenders refused to extend credit to anyone they were not absolutely certain could repay. The days that followed were terrifying for those who understood what was happening. The entire financial system seemed on the verge of collapse. Money market funds, considered among the safest investments, saw their values fall below the stable $1 per share that investors expected. Companies could not borrow the short-term funds they needed for routine operations. The machinery of finance was seizing up. The government responded with unprecedented intervention. The Federal Reserve lent hundreds of billions of dollars to keep financial institutions functioning. Congress passed the Troubled Asset Relief Program, authorizing up to $700 billion to stabilize the banking system. The Treasury guaranteed money market funds. The Federal Reserve cut interest rates to near zero. Perhaps most dramatically, the government took direct stakes in major financial institutions. Citigroup, Bank of America, and many others received capital injections that made the federal government a major shareholder. The investment was not made out of any desire for public ownership, but out of necessity. The banks needed capital, and no private source would provide it. The rescue was controversial. Many Americans were furious that the banks that had created the crisis were being bailed out with taxpayer money while ordinary people lost their homes and jobs. The anger was understandable. The crisis had not been caused by ordinary depositors or homeowners. It had been caused by decisions made in executive suites and trading floors, by risks taken in pursuit of profits that enriched a few while endangering many. Yet the alternative to rescue was potentially worse. A complete collapse of the financial system would have meant not just bank failures, but the failure of the entire economy. Businesses would have been unable to make payroll or pay suppliers. The ordinary transactions of daily life would have ground to a halt. The Great Depression had shown what happened when the banking system was allowed to fail, and no one wanted to repeat that experience. The immediate crisis passed, though the recovery was slow and painful. The recession that followed the financial crisis was the worst since the 1930s. Unemployment rose above 10%. Home prices continued to fall. Millions of families lost their homes to foreclosure. The scars would last for years. In the aftermath, policymakers sought to prevent a recurrence. The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, passed in 2010, was the most comprehensive financial regulation since the 1930s. It created new agencies to oversee financial stability and protect consumers. It required banks to hold more capital and submit to stress tests that simulated crisis conditions. It imposed restrictions on the riskiest forms of trading and derivatives. Internationally, regulators developed new standards known as Basel III, requiring banks worldwide to maintain stronger capital positions. The too-big-to-fail institutions that had required government rescue would be subject to enhanced oversight and require to prepare living wills, plans for their orderly wind-down in case of failure. Whether these reforms were sufficient to prevent another crisis remained a matter of debate. Some argue they did not go far enough, that the fundamental problems of an overly complex and interconnected financial system had not been addressed. Others complained that the regulations were too burdensome, stifling innovation and economic growth. The debate continued, as debates about banking have continued since ancient times. As the financial system recovered from the crisis, a new force was emerging that would challenge traditional banking in unexpected ways. Technology companies, nimble and innovative, began offering services that had once been the exclusive province of banks. The era of financial technology, or fintech, had arrived. The smartphone revolution that began with the iPhone in 2007 transformed how people interacted with their money. Banks developed mobile apps that allowed customers to check balances, transfer funds, and deposit checks simply by taking photographs. The branch visits and paper statements that had defined banking for generations gave way to taps and swipes on glass screens. But it was not only traditional banks that saw the opportunity. New companies emerged to offer payment services, lending, and other financial products without the overhead of branch networks and legacy computer systems. PayPal had pioneered online payments in the late 1990s. Now it was joined by a proliferation of startups with names like Square, Stripe, Venmo, and countless others. These companies often served customers that traditional banks had overlooked. Small businesses that struggled to accept credit card payments found new options. Individuals who could not qualify for bank loans turned to online lenders that used algorithms rather than loan officers to assess creditworthiness. The unbanked and underbanked, people without access to traditional financial services, found new pathways to participate in the financial system. Mobile payments transformed commerce in ways that varied by region. In China, apps like Alipay and WeChat Pay became ubiquitous, allowing consumers to pay for everything from restaurant meals to street vendor purchases with their phones. Cash became almost obsolete in many Chinese cities. In Africa, mobile money services like M-Pesa brought financial services to millions who had never had bank accounts. The developed world adopted mobile payments more slowly, perhaps because existing systems worked well enough. But the trend was clear. The physical artifacts of banking, the checkbooks and deposit slips and even the plastic cards were giving way to digital transactions processed invisibly through networks of computers. In 2009, an anonymous figure or group using the name Satoshi Nakamoto introduced something that seemed to challenge the very foundations of banking. Bitcoin was a digital currency that operated without any central authority, without banks, without governments. Transactions were recorded on a distributed ledger called a blockchain, maintained by a network of computers around the world. Bitcoin and the thousands of cryptocurrencies that followed represented a radical vision of money. They proposed to replace the trust in institutions that had been the foundation of banking since ancient times with trust in mathematics and computer code. No bank could freeze your cryptocurrency account. No government could inflate away its value. The system was, in theory, beyond human control. The reality proved more complicated. Cryptocurrency prices were wildly volatile, rising and falling by percentages that would be unimaginable for traditional currencies. Exchanges where cryptocurrencies were traded proved vulnerable to hacking and fraud. The promise of decentralization gave way, in practice, to new forms of concentration and control. Yet the underlying blockchain technology inspired legitimate interest from traditional financial institutions. Banks explored using distributed ledgers to make their own operations more efficient. Central banks considered issuing digital currencies that would combine the convenience of cryptocurrency with the stability of government backing. The technology that had been created to bypass banks was being adopted by banks themselves. Another innovation was changing the relationship between banks and their customers. Open banking, mandated by regulation in Europe and spreading elsewhere, required banks to share customer data with authorized third parties. If you gave permission, a budgeting app could access your transaction history directly from your bank. A loan comparison service could assess your finances without requiring you to gather statements manually. Open banking represented a shift in power from banks to customers. Your financial data, which banks had traditionally controlled, became portable, usable by whatever service you chose. Banks that had once competed on the basis of their branch networks and relationship managers now competed on the quality of their digital services and their willingness to integrate with other platforms. Through all these changes, the fundamental functions of banking remained the same. People still needed safe places to store their money. Businesses still needed credit to grow. Payments still needed to flow from buyer to seller. The technology was different. The institutions were different. But the underlying human needs were unchanged. And beneath the gleaming surface of digital banking, the old institutions endured. The Federal Reserve still managed the money supply and stood ready to act as lender of last resort. The FDIC still guaranteed deposits, the quiet assurance that made bank runs a thing of the past. The regulatory frameworks, reformed and strengthened after the crisis, still governed how banks could operate. A customer today can manage their finances entirely through a smartphone, never setting foot in a bank branch, never speaking to a human banker. They can send money across the world in seconds, borrow funds with a few taps, invest in markets that once required expensive intermediaries. The convenience would astonish a banker from even a generation ago. Yet that same customer is participating in a system whose roots reach back millennia. The deposit they make is conceptually identical to grain stored in a Mesopotamian temple. The interest they pay or receive is the same mash, the same natural increase that Sumerian scribes recorded on clay tablets. The trust they place in their bank is the same trust that made the trapezitai of Athens and the argentarii of Rome possible. The technology changes, the institutions evolve, but the human needs remain constant, and the solutions to those needs are variations on themes that were established when civilization was young. Banking is one of humanity's oldest technologies, refined over thousands of years, adapted to circumstances that its creators could never have imagined, yet fundamentally recognizable across all its transformations. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, the banking system continues its quiet work. Somewhere a deposit is being made. Somewhere a loan is being repaid. Somewhere numbers are flowing through networks of computers, ledgers balancing just as they have balanced since the first scribe pressed stylus to clay. The system endures, as it has always endured, carrying the trust of millions safely through the night. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, having travelled from temple storerooms to digital networks, from clay tablets to glowing screens. We have walked alongside merchants and monarchs, goldsmiths and visionaries, each of them finding ways to keep something precious safe until it was needed again. Through all the centuries we've explored, one truth emerges softly. Trust is the thread that binds it all together. The trust that a deposit will be honoured, that a promise will be kept, that the ledger will balance in the morning as it balanced tonight. You are part of this story too. Every time you save or spend, borrow or lend, you participate in something ancient and ongoing, a system built by countless hands over countless generations. The same human needs, the same elegant solutions refined across millennia. Now let that thought settle gently around you. The vaults are secure, the numbers add up. The work of banking continues quietly through the night, asking nothing of you but rest. So breathe slowly, let your thoughts grow soft and distant, and allow yourself to drift. The ledger is balanced, the trust holds, and you can let go now, carried safely into sleep.